Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Sarah Ludemann was new to love. The Pinellas, Florida 17-year-old was a late bloomer. When she fell for a boy, she was blind to the world of sex, drugs, and drama swirling around her. Soon, Sarah had a bitter enemy, an 18-year-old waitress, Rachel Wade. Both girls were head over heels with a cocky two-timer named Joshua Camacho. On a warm spring night, their passions erupted into violence. A knife flashed under the streetlights. When the fight was over, one girl was dead and the other charged with murder. In an emotion-packed courtroom, the whole story took shape, a troubling tale of conflicting lives, tangled sexual affairs, and the high price of having the right feelings for the wrong guy. The book that's featured this evening is called A Knife in the Heart by my special guest journalist and author and returned guest, Michael Benson. Welcome to the program, and thank you to agreeing this interview, Michael Benson.
Good evening, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Good evening. Thank you. Now, let's maybe set the stage with this Pinellas Park here, what type of community it is, and tell us, because both of these young women grew up in this neighborhood. So tell us about this Pinellas, Florida neighborhood. What was it really like?
Well, Pinellas Park, Florida is a working-class town. It's between Tampa Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. It's landlocked, even though it's near the Florida shore, the East Shore. The West Shore, rather, and it's an industrial city. Most folks have blue-collar jobs, and although most people are getting by, it's not a place of much upward mobility or ambition. I don't want to paint the entire city with too broad of a brush, but it certainly seems like it's the case in this particular pack of people that there's a segment of the population that gets stuck in place, casting kind of a malaise, an ennui, a cloud of depression that affected both the grown-ups and, by chain reaction, their teenage children.
Right.
And the book takes place in kind of a mean girls gone wild world. It's sex, drugs, and unfortunately, in this case, murder. It was the early morning hours of April 15th, tax day, 2008, just about exactly 4 years ago. And it was between an 18-year-old high school senior and 19-year-old waitress. She had dropped out of school and had her own apartment. And the feud was between the young women had been building up for many months over a boy, and it was inflamed by social networking. They taunted each other on MySpace, and with each new tweet, or whatever you want to call it, there were great escalations of fury and cattiness. The fight took place in the middle of a quiet residential street. Sarah Ludemann, who was the younger girl, is a student. She brought along two friends, and the 19-year-old, who was Rachel Wade, considerably smaller than Sarah. She didn't bring any friends with her, but she did bring a knife. And the fight lasted no more than 5 seconds. And when it was over, Sarah lay in the street mortally wounded by a stab wound to the heart. There were go ahead.
So what precipitated this, though? Because you talk about she came with the kitchen knife. So explain how it was that Sarah and her friends came to be at Rachel Wade's apartment or home. Tell us the scenario.
During the evening that this occurred, hostilities had been growing. Rachel wanted to spend the night with the boyfriend Joshua, but Joshua had Sarah over. Joshua was staying at the time with his sister. And insults went back and forth, and they'd driven past each other's houses. They were shouting things. And Rachel had reason to believe that she was going to be jumped by more than one girl, and armed herself to protect herself.
With a kitchen knife.
With a kitchen knife. She grabbed the kitchen knife and put it in her purse on her way out the door, and then she went over to a friend's house where she thought that she would be safe. So, go ahead.
Now, why wasn't she safe at this location? How did Sarah and her friends find out where she was?
What happened was she goes over to her friend Javier's house, and Javier LeBoy was an ex-boyfriend and then a platonic friend at the time. And Javier has a friend over named Dustin Grimes, and they're hanging out in the front yard. And Javier's mom is asleep in the house. So instead of taking Rachel, who fears that she's going to be jumped, into the house where she wouldn't be seen, they're all hanging out in front of the house. And when a friend of Sarah's drives by and spots them, word travels fast, and next thing you know, there's a rumble in the middle of the street. Now there are four. Yeah, go ahead.
Now you're saying that Rachel thought she might be jumped by more than one person, and they had this long, or at least in terms of teenage life, a long-standing feud that was getting escalating with each text message.
It had gone on for months. There had been a break. It was really bad for a while, and then there was a break, and then it had started up again.
Now, how serious was the actual threat where she actually apparently said, "I will kill you"?
Well, the one thing that we'll get into is that Rachel is a victim of her own big mouth. She was she's a diminutive blonde, kind of sweet-looking, but when she felt threatened, she really could let loose with, she was a barker, not a biter, was her reputation.
Okay.
She could just go into a tirade of insults and vulgarity, and she used that as a way to keep people away,
right?
And to hurt back when she felt that she had been hurt. But I think the fascinating thing about this case, and I don't know if you agree, but it's that there are eyewitnesses, and the eyewitnesses come in two camps. There's Sarah's witnesses, and there are Rachel's witnesses, and they don't agree on much.
No.
Now, Rachel's friends all spoke of a small woman defending herself against three larger women who had jumped her. And Sarah's friends spoke of Rachel charging at Sarah and immediately plunging the kitchen knife into Sarah's chest.
Yeah.
So I just should also say that by the time this happens, the Pinellas Park Police Department is really sick of these kids. They've been a problem for years. There's drug dealers. And every move, every social move seems to be dramatized into something straight out of West Side Story. There's car chases, all kinds of reckless driving, and just a few days before the murder, several local high school kids have been killed in a car crash.
Right.
And now you've got Sarah screaming to Javier LeBoy's house in her parents' minivan, almost going up on two wheels to make the turn and screeching to a halt, 3 feet away from the nose of Rachel's car. Yeah. So, the other thing is that Joshua Camacho, who's the boy, the warring parties share, he is an instigator. And he has told them both, if you love me enough, you will fight for me. Now, he's not even there.
And describe this guy, too, because you talk about diminutives. Like, tell me because we got photos of this guy posing, he's got tattoos, he's a gangster kind of guy.
Yeah.
So, but describe what he is, and, like his stature, really.
Right. I mean, if you had to guess what he looked like based just on the behavior of his women, you would guess that he was tall, dark, and handsome. The truth was really different and in a way more interesting. He was an undersized, pretty boy who didn't work for a living, but instead leached from his girlfriends. As a guy who made playing women into a science. He'd had a baby with one teen girlfriend. He lived for a time in Rachel Wade's apartment for free, and he took Sarah Ludemann's virginity. At Rachel's trial, he described his relationship with all of these women as friends with benefits. You know, no emotion at all. His controlling nature, his need to play puppet master, came through loud and clear, I thought, when you learned that he had instructed Sarah not to wear shorts in public, no matter how hot it was outside, because he decided that he wanted to be the only one who got to see her legs. And Sarah didn't even question it. She wore long pants.
Yeah. Well, they're young, though, and I mean, a lot of this stuff, I mean, controlling people is nothing new. I mean, there's a lot of jealous, controlling people, both sexes.
No, that's true.
But it's interesting what you did talk about and what I was going to ask, because we want to make sure that this wasn't out of character for these young girls. They lived in this sort of world, and you did describe this over-exaggerated sort of world they thought they were living in, you know. So. Right,
and it was a promiscuous crowd. Sure. A warning to readers with gentle sensibilities that quite a bit of sex talk going on. As one cop put it immediately following the murder, it wasn't over a love triangle as much as it was around a love hexagon.
Hexagon.
Rachel Wade discovered sex at a very tender age. She was a classic example of too much too soon. And Sarah Ludemann, on the other hand, was an overweight girl, large, teased by friends, and a late bloomer with boys. And Joshua Camacho was her one and only. In terms of scheduling, Josh's girlfriends were perfectly complementary to each other. Sarah was a high school girl with a curfew and had to be home early, and Rachel was a restaurant waitress who wasn't available until late. Yeah. So he could see both every night, and they never ran into each other until this night Rachel has the night off, and all hell breaks loose. So Camacho's the consummate player, and he gives not that much. He convinces each girl that they are his one and only, although anybody from the outside looking in can tell immediately what sort of person he is. Not just scheduling, but I think the two girls were complementary as well in terms of their personalities, sexual and otherwise. Rachel's cute Applebee's waitress with a wild lifestyle. She's a sexual experimenter, and she's unfortunately just as intense out of the sack as she is in. And Sarah, she switched schools so she could be closer to Joshua Camacho. She adores him completely.
Why is it that Rachel is living with a friend, or why is she not living with her parents?
Well, that's Rachel's only 15 when troubles start. She lives at home with her parents, but she gets busted for skipping school in order to have sex with her older, technically adult boyfriend. Right. And Rachel's parents had the boy arrested and charged with statutory rape. Now, right. That incident for Rachel begins a pattern of running away from home. She disappears for a couple of days, and she returns home with sometimes with a detailed explanation, sometimes with a vague explanation. Each time, Rachel's parents called the police and filed a report. And the police, in quite a few cases, they just went to the house of whoever her boyfriend was, found her, and brought her home. Now, sometimes Rachel ran away simply because she had a better offer than to sleep at home with her parents. And other times, she ran off because of violent arguments she had mostly with her mother. Once Rachel threw a knife at her mother before running out the door. Asked why the Wades continued calling the police even though they knew where Rachel probably was, Barry Wade, the dad, said that he'd been advised by the police to keep a paper trail of everything because all that documentation would come in handy when it came time to take further action regarding Rachel's behavior. Right. Now, I should mention that a large contributor to this entire tragedy is drugs. They're all smoking pot, and there's a frightening number of the city's young people who are addicted to an opiate painkiller they call Roxy's. The brand name, I guess, was Roxycodone. There are blue pills, and some kids call them blues. There's been a major...
Oxycontin, most likely?
Yeah, I think it's very similar, just maybe a different manufacturer. But there's been a major theft at the pharmaceutical warehouse, and hundreds of thousands of these pills were stolen.
Wow.
And it causes a tragic wave of serious drug addiction throughout Florida. Kids are taking the pills unaware that they're becoming addicted to the same active substance that's in heroin.
Sure.
So there's a tendency anyway for young people to feel immortal. They don't feel anxiety about danger the same way older adults do. They're careless, they're reckless, and the natural tendency was exacerbated by the Roxys, which further removed inhibitions and created a pain-free illusion of euphoria. Too many of Pinellas Park's teenage girls were skipping school, hanging out with older boyfriends who had apartments of their own. They were taking drugs, having sex, and making babies. But our insight into Rachel during those years is a beautiful young woman named Lisa LaFrance. And she is also interesting from my point of view because she was the only witness I had who could honestly claim to be friends with both Sarah and Rachel.
Right.
Now Lisa and Rachel had boyfriends who were roommates when they were teenagers. And they spent a lot of time together having sex and taking drugs in close proximity. And while our best info is that Rachel, for all of her manic behavior, was no longer doing drugs, Lisa developed a severe painkiller addiction. Roxy's took over my life is what she told me. And not long before the murder, Lisa was visiting Rachel at Rachel's apartment, and they had a fight. That was the Wade's final way of taking care of the runaway problem, is they allowed Rachel to quit school and get her own apartment. And
right.
It was almost working. She had a job. She'd gotten her GED. Anyway, but Lisa and Rachel are together in Rachel's apartment not long before the murder, and Lisa's slurring her words and acting out of it, and Rachel gave her an ultimatum. Quit the pills, or they couldn't be friends anymore, and Lisa chose the pills. She said she was high all the time. She was high the night that Sarah died, and I'm personally happy to report that Lisa's since gotten off drugs, and she seems cheerful enough, gainfully employed, and taking it one day at a time.
Right. That's good.
Now, let's talk about the voicemails.
Yes, that's key evidence at the trial.
Yeah, as it turns out. This is months before the murder, during the first feud between Sarah and Rachel over Joshua. Rachel left a series of voicemails on Sarah's phone. And as it turns out, these tapes were one of the most psychologically effective pieces of evidence for the prosecution.
Sure.
They're threatening, they're obscene, and even though they occurred months before the murder, so that in legal terms, the relevance was diminished, their emotional power remained very strong. They were so scary that Sarah called the cops, who recommended she save the recording, that she did. And that's how they ended up being evidence against Rachel at the trial. The Rachel whose voice is on those tapes is just monstrous. She delivered a profanity-strewn, manic monologue of insults and threats. She sounded precisely like the type of person who would stab someone in the chest in cold blood. Every time I listen to those voicemails, I get the distinct impression that there's something wrong with Rachel, something organic, some synapse in her brain that isn't firing correctly. She sounds for all the world as if she's written out a speech ahead of time and then is reading it as fast as she could.
Right.
So, later on, I think it becomes important because her defense attorney has no choice but to put her on the stand because he can't allow those tapes to be her testimony.
Well, plus she's pleading self-defense, so she has to take the stand. Really?
That too, yeah. So let's go through the witnesses, the eyewitnesses. There are two girls in the minivan with Sarah. Sarah's driving her father's minivan. Sitting in the front seat with her, first and foremost, is Janet Camacho. Now, she's Joshua's sister, and she is the original tough girl. She's both friends with Sarah, and she hates Rachel's guts because she thought Rachel was a bad influence on her brother. After Rachel Wade had stabbed Sarah, it was Janet Camacho who grabbed Rachel and gave her a good beating.
Right.
At first, Janet takes off one of her sandals and starts smacking, trying to get the knife out of her hand. She smacks Rachel over the head with it. And later, Janet had Rachel by the hair, and she's dragging her around the Javier LeBoy's front lawn. And Rachel makes no attempt to use her knife on Janet. Somehow during this altercation, Rachel manages to free herself for long enough to run away and throw the knife away as far as she can, and it's later found on a neighbor's roof.
Right.
And the prosecution claimed that Rachel was trying to hide the weapon, while the defense made the also reasonable claim that she got rid of the knife in self-defense, that she was afraid Janet was going to take it away from her and use it on her. And in court, Janet was very, very pregnant and nonetheless had a tough girl strut as she entered and exited the courtroom. And while on the stand, she kept staring at Rachel, like high beams on, almost licking her chops, obviously thinking about what she would do if she could just have 5 minutes alone in a room with Rachel Wade.
Sure.
Sitting in the back seat of the van. Yeah, well, go ahead.
I wanted to ask one thing, though.
Yeah, sure.
Wasn't she stabbed twice? Like, where exactly was she stabbed? And was she stabbed twice in this very specific spot in the chest? You say the chest, but
she was stabbed twice. The first wound is up in the shoulder, and it's just a flesh wound. It would have been a matter of stitches.
Right.
The second stab, which is a fraction of a second later, goes through the skin, through the muscle, between the ribs, through the pleural sac, and into the heart itself.
Right.
And so she had mustered up a considerable amount of strength in her anger.
Did Sarah die right away, or how long was it?
Well, Sarah died pretty quickly. She manages to get her cell phone out, and she calls Joshua, and she says it hurts, and then collapses on the street right next to her van. The driver door is still open.
Yeah.
And what happens at that point, of course, depends on which eyewitness you're listening to. So yeah, as I said, there were Sarah had 2 friends with her, and sitting in the back seat is Jaleesa Smith, who is a larger girl. She's maybe 5'8", something like that, and she's related to the father of Janet Camacho's babies. So they're related by marriage, and Jaleesa sometimes comes over to babysit. And naturally, Jaleesa's memories support the prosecution. But she has elements of her story that aren't in anyone else's version. She says she missed key action because she dropped her phone and the back popped off, and she was picking that up and putting the phone back together as things were going on. And she remembered holding Janet back physically so she couldn't attack Rachel when everyone else remembered Janet beating the tar out of Rachel with Jaleesa doing nothing to stop her. But still, it was Jaleesa who first realized that Sarah had been stabbed and had collapsed to the pavement. It was Jaleesa's screams that, Sarah's been stabbed, and that alerted the others that there was a medical emergency. Jaleesa, when she did get her phone back in one piece, also successfully called 911 and reported the stabbing. Now, over on Rachel's side of the eyewitnesses, you have Javier LeBoy, and he is going to be her best friend. He's decided that he has seen it. He's the only eyewitness who sees things exactly the way that Rachel herself sees them.
Yeah, of course.
He sees 3 girls piling out of the van at once, whereas Sarah's friends say they don't get out of the van until after the stabbing.
Yeah, that's pretty crucial.
It's a one-on-one fight.
Yeah, that's crucial.
And Javier says that all 3 girls get out of the van at once and charge at Rachel, who then has to defend herself. Now, during the first few months that Rachel's in jail, it's Javier who becomes her boyfriend, and we have tapes of him on the phone reassuring her that this is all temporary, that everything's going to be okay once the jury realizes the truth. You hear them daydreaming about their life together. They're going to get married, have children. They talk about what they're going to name their children after Rachel is acquitted. And Javier's friend Dustin Grimes, he's just happens to be over visiting Javier. He doesn't have a dog in this fight, but I would think that he has the least biased viewpoint, and he's as close as we get to an impartial witness, and
potentially,
and he does say things that please both sides. He says that Rachel moved forward, away from her own car and towards Sarah's with a knife in her hand, not a girl on the defensive. But he also says, and this must absolutely thrill the defense attorney, he says that all three girls in the van get out at the same time and come charging towards Rachel. Now, the other interesting thing about Dustin is that he enlisted in the military after the murder, and he knew that he was going to be overseas during the trial. So his testimony was recorded earlier in the same courtroom with all the same parties present except for the jury, and then the TV tape was played for the jury, and they had to synchronize things so that the jury would be seeing pieces of evidence as they were introduced on the tape. And it was his courtroom procedure. It was a little odd.
Yeah, and he knew so there was no cross-examination, so it's a whole lot less strenuous than obviously going to court.
Yeah, well, you're right, exactly. And it's just interesting that you tend to think of a trial that is being ad-libbed, that it's being played out sort of off the cuff. And when you go back to a tape that was made months before and you play it and it fits in perfectly, you realize that this trials are pretty well scripted.
What I wanted to ask you is that because you've written, over 40 books, and true crime is not the only thing you've written about, but definitely you understand the legal process. In your mind, when you were looking at this case before the trial, and when I'm looking at it too, did you have an idea of what technically is self-defense? She came out of the home with a knife in the purse. Is really not the definition of self-defense. Doesn't mean a jury won't take it that way, but that's a little bit of a stretch of self-defense, isn't it?
Well, I think that there's a standard rule. You don't bring a knife to a fist fight.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that complicates matters is that Florida has the new stand your ground rule.
Right.
Or many states, and they say that if you can, you should run. But in Florida, it's too sissy, and they're having a lot of acquittals with self-defense defenses.
That's true.
Because it says you are allowed to stand your ground even though you are being attacked, which is the case here.
And and you're supposed to be able to use force plus one, and if you have three people, bringing your fist to a fist fight still doesn't work out with three people.
No, that's assuming that three people are actually attacking her.
That's right.
I think there's strong evidence that the girls attacked. That Jaleesa never hurt anybody, and that Janet and Sarah attacked Rachel one at a time. I think it was an interesting case in that I didn't know what the verdict was going to be.
Right.
Unless there is unless there's a strong legal ending, chances are it doesn't become a book because you don't want to put the word allegedly in 5,000 times when you're writing a book.
Yeah.
But the question afterwards was, was she charged properly? She was arrested that night and charged with second-degree murder.
Right.
And was that correct? Was second-degree murder means that Rachel deliberately killed Sarah with that knife, but she decided to do it on the spur of the moment.
Right.
And some thought that Rachel was undercharged because
really
premeditation only takes a matter of seconds, and wasn't the fact that she had the knife with her in the first place evidence of premeditation. And then there were others who thought that Rachel was overcharged, that she should have been charged with manslaughter, that she had a reckless disregard for Sarah's safety was true, but she had not intentionally killed her. That she didn't have the skills to purposefully do the damage that she did. She was just flailing.
Was there a question of that she had stabbed her once, like you say, a surface wound, but then went in for not for the kill, but the lethal stab wound that went right to the heart quickly? I mean, this was lethal. Was there a question of that? If she was just defending herself, wouldn't have the stab itself? Most people, whether they're stabbed fatally or not, are not going to keep attacking. So was there any question about that incident itself?
Well, there was not an eyewitness who could identify when the stabbing took place.
Okay.
Two girls, it all happened so fast. The girls come together in the middle of the street, and there is just, a mad flurry of motion. Hair and arms and, screaming, and then they separate. And at first, everything seems to be okay. Sarah walks back to her van, standing up, and Rachel backs off and moves away, and it looks like it's over. And it's not until Sarah goes down. She's bleeding. Most of her bleeding is internal. That more chaos erupts again. But there's, we don't have anybody who says, yeah, she stabbed her once and that wasn't good enough, so she stabbed her again. The two stabs were part of a flurry of motion and nobody on either side could distinguish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but I mean, her defense believed that her actions were protected under Florida's right to stand your ground law, and that she'd been jumped 3-on-1, and that rendered the use of the knife justifiable. I had no idea what the jury was going to do with this case. You look at Rachel, at the opening of your program, the most notorious and shocking killers. The shocking thing about Rachel Wade being a killer is that she looks completely harmless. Moments after the murder's over, she's sitting on a bench in front of Javier's house, and she's asking a cop if she can bum a cigarette. She looks like a sullen cheerleader.
What was her actions like after her arrest? In terms of now, you get a lot of cases. In this one, obviously they look very closely at the person's behavior after, and if there's any visits, phone calls. So what was the behavior right after that? Was she still cocky? I mean, what was she like?
No, she was quiet. She seemed a little dazed. She sat there and watched as the ambulance pulled up. And she lied. I mean, this was the thing. She lied. She said she didn't know how Sarah got stabbed. She had no clue. It wasn't
memory
until
lapse.
Yeah. She remembered everything except stabbing Sarah.
Yeah.
Which is probably not the way to go, because it seemed phony baloney.
Sure.
We talked for a second about the families, because the two families in this case are really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's harder to lose a daughter to death than to lose her to prison, maybe, but you just can't pick sides.
Yeah, equally not so good.
Yeah, with the Ludemanns, this is the 8th or 9th true crime book I've written, and the families of the victims always make my heart go out. That never changes. They want to do their best to protect their child's legacy, and yet they want privacy. They sometimes treat writers like me like unwanted traveling salesmen, and others treat me like free of charge therapist. I'm using my shoulder to cry on, and that's fine. Yeah. I'm injecting myself into their lives. The Ludemanns were of the latter group, although it didn't do me any good, because by the time I got to them, they had already participated in a national TV show dealing with their daughter's death and had signed an exclusivity agreement to not give interviews to anyone else. So our discussions were brief, but there were plenty of things that I did know. I knew that their despair knew no bounds of intensity. Charlie Ludemann was a large man with bad knees, a cab driver who, along with his wife and only child, had moved to Florida from New York City because they wanted to be where it was safe.
Yeah.
And when Sarah died, Charlie repeatedly dialed Sarah's cell phone so he could listen to her recorded voice saying, "Hi, wait for the beep." He realized that was the only chance he was going to have to hear her voice from then on. He had some of Sarah's ashes injected under his skin as part of a tattoo, so he'd carry a little of her around with him forever. On the other side, Rachel's mom, a long-suffering mother, she had an older son. Rachel had an older brother, and he no longer lived at home. He was estranged from the family for reasons that are never spoken out loud. And we just know that Rachel can't stand him. And then came Rachel after the brother had moved out, and she caused even more grief. She ran away again and again. As Rachel's mom would put it, she had the hotsy-totsies. She had taste for grown men, and she wanted more. And it was Rachel's mom who really freaked out the most when she heard that Rachel was being charged with murder. It was the last straw. She just broke. She just when she thought she couldn't be hurt even more by her children, Rachel went and did it. It was as if she'd stabbed her own mother in the heart. The woman withdrew into a shell and seemed in a deep state of shock both during the days after Rachel's arrest and culminating in court, where at one point during the proceedings, Mom buried her face in her husband's chest and just violently shuddered for seemingly forever. And Rachel's dad, also in a state of shock, was physically trying to keep his wife inside her skin. She was shaking so hard. It's really very rough to watch.
Well, Rachel had a lot of friends, high school friends as well, that attended the trial, didn't they?
Yeah, the place was packed with young people. And one of the True TV reporters who was covering the trial in person said that during the breaks, the hallway outside the courtroom sounded like a high school cafeteria with all the chatter going on. It was an extremely young crowd. But yeah, Lisa LaFrance was there, and a lot of Rachel's waitress friends. A lot of Rachel's friends and a lot of Sarah's friends had really their best friends had advised both these women or counseled these women, or especially in Sarah's case, had actually spoken to them and said, "That's it, I'm off this guy. This guy's done it again." So there was a lot of advice from their friends and a lot of friends to say, "Listen, you guys deserve better than this guy." Well, that's true, and of course they did. But it has to do with the social networking. When you put something onto a social network that embarrasses somebody, it's not private. It's as if you're doing it with everybody standing around watching. Well, sure. And I mean, one of Sarah's most interesting friends was Ashley Lovelady, and she was important to the evening's events because, if we believe the official version of the story, it was Ashley who spotted Rachel hanging out in front of Javier's house and told Sarah and her two friends where Rachel could be found. When first interviewed by the police, Ashley denied her role, and after a day's thought, she realized that this was too important for her to lie about. She just not been sure how much trouble she'd be in if she admitted to what she'd done. Ashley was the trial's first witness and got the emotional ball rolling when she burst into tears as she discussed the way that Pinellas Park girls were abused by their men. Ashley had dated Joshua Camacho's older brother. Now, what was Joshua doing? Like during this trial, was he posting anything on his Facebook account, or his MySpace account? Was there any activity like that from this Joshua? No, he drops out of the situation. He refuses to go with Sarah's father to see her body in the hospital. He is not allowed to attend her funeral. He only appears at the trial in order to testify. And he sees, he's lost one girlfriend to death and the other one to jail. And the third, Erin Slothauer, who is the mother of his child, she's always going to be around. She's an interesting character too. She refused to give interviews, but she did talk a little bit with me. She was Joshua's first girlfriend. They'd met in grammar school, and they had a child together. And once she got pregnant, of course, he lost interest. And for her part, she was a real-life teen mom, and she understood that Joshua was useless, and she was going to have to step up and be the responsible one. She went back to school. She earned a college degree. She was pregnant. While she was pregnant, she was working full-time. She had her life together. And by the time Rachel killed Sarah, she was out of that world. She didn't hear anything about it until the next day. And when I finally got her to make a comment, what she said was, the whole thing is just so sad. Crazy teens so caught up in their own drama that someone had to die.
Yeah. It is interesting. It is interesting. Yeah. It is interesting, too, that Josh did not, he couldn't attend a trial as being a witness, but after he did appear as a witness, he could appear at the trial. So I thought it kind of odd that he didn't. That he just, despite the advice, this kid really turned, as much as he had this tough guy persona that he was presenting, he took the advice of, I guess, the prosecutor and his parents or whatever, and he really did not act like the character is portrayed earlier in your account of him.
Absolutely not. He in fact, he ran away. He went to New York. I think he's now returned to Florida, but he went into hiding. Anyway, an interesting sidebar. The first journalist to interview Rachel's parents after the murder was a woman named Lane DeGregory, and she was a features writer for the Tampa Bay Times.
Right.
And it was during her first days of covering the case that she learned that she had won a Pulitzer Prize. And she turned out to be a tremendous asset to my book because she offered me a lead that led to a whole new mine of information, that being the Rachel prison tapes.
Right.
When Rachel was first thrown in jail, she thought that it was a temporary thing, and soon enough, everyone would calm down and figure out that she was just defending herself, and she'd be a free woman once again. So she used up a lot of her phone time having phone sex with boys.
Yeah. Why not?
She seemed to think that it was the only way for her to keep their attention, interestingly enough. When she wandered to more serious subjects, they seemed to their interest flagged. So she kept talking about sex. And apparently prisoner phone sex is not that uncommon, despite the fact that everyone knows all conversations are being recorded by the authorities and anything they say can be used against them. Rachel's dad warned her early not to discuss the stabbing. But he didn't say, don't have phone sex with your boyfriends. And the recordings of those conversations are very revealing as we try to figure out, what makes Rachel tick. She asked one guy what was the first thing he was going to do when he saw her, and he says he's going to grab her and squeeze her and kiss her neck. And she said the first thing when she saw him, she was going to become his little head monster, and she was going to take care of business. This guy wasn't as good at phone sex as she was. He kept trying to put the action inside the jail with Rachel and her cellmates, and she wasn't going to go for that. So the tapes start out with hot chat with this boy named Jeremy, and then he loses interest when he realizes that she's not going to be home next week. And then she starts in with Javier Laboy, and she's smart enough to cut out the porn and move to more romantic things with Javier. He's a little bit classier guy. And then, as I said, they talk about their life together and how they're going to get married. And now, unfortunately, this is all being taped, and the prosecutor uses the tape later on to attack, LaBoy's credibility on the stand. You'd say anything. You want to marry her.
Yeah,
so, as you said, the trial is both shocking and spectacular. It's just high drama. The jury had to decide if Rachel had murdered Sarah Ludemann because it was 3-on-1, or if she had a right to defend herself with deadly force. And the presentation of the eyewitnesses formed a perfect framework for the telling of the story, which made things relatively easy for me. The wildly differing ways that the eyewitnesses saw things, it proves once and for all that memory is a vague thing, that we argue to support our beliefs rather than the truth, and how easily influenced we are, how imagination joins hands with memory so easily, especially during a shocking moment. And the most dramatic moment of the trial is when Rachel Wade takes the stand in her own defense. It's a risky move for defense attorney Jay Aber, but like you said, in a self-defense case, have to put her on, and ultimately doesn't really pay off. It goes well during direct examination. He rather stringently controls her words through carefully constructed sentences. They worked as a team, describing for the jury the fear Rachel felt and how she was jumped by multiple girls and how she feared she was going to be beaten to a pulp. And she thought, maybe Joshua had a gun, maybe his sister had the gun, maybe he'd lent the gun to Sarah. She felt she had a very good reason to arm herself that night, but the purpose of the knife was never to use it. It was just to show it, and the sight of that blade was going to cause the gang to back down, and there would be peace in the world. And that was the plan. And it had gone horribly wrong. It was so tragic, and hoo-hoo-hoo. So direct examination goes...
Okay, so go ahead.
Direct examination goes well, but then Rachel's turned over to prosecutor Suzette Hanowitz, who lights into her like a wolverine. Now, Hanowitz speaks very fast. She interrupts Rachel's answers. She yells, and Rachel did not take it well. She lost control of her emotions and began to babble, and words spilled out, completely out of her attorney's control at this point. And she said stuff that was damaging. Yes, she threatened to murder Sarah. Yes, she carried out that threat. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
So, but, as I said before we get too critical of Mr. Hebert, he's got to put her on, not only because of the self-defense, but because of those damn tapes of her threatening Sarah on the phone voicemails.
But what did you think of the argument that he put forth? Anyway, it seems almost on the line of not being able to be eligible for self-defense by saying that, well, she just brought out the knife because she thought they may have a gun. Well, that's almost the definition of it doesn't matter. You went to a robbery. You didn't know that you were going to encounter any difficulty, and the guy ends up dead. Guess what? It's murder.
Yeah. So, well, I don't think anybody bought the thing about the gun. It was perfectly clear that the gun wasn't mentioned during preliminary hearings. It was a late entry into the story. Sort of a desperate last-ditch attempt. Yeah.
But I'm saying that, what did you think of his? I mean, he didn't really even have a good argument anyway. In terms of actual self-defense, if you already brought out a weapon in case, and then something else happens, that's not much of a self-defense excuse either. That's as strong as he could present.
That's right. He could only use it to address her state of mind.
Yeah.
That she is, and as he never said she was afraid. He always said she was in fear. I thought it was an odd affectation. I'm not quite sure what that was supposed to accomplish. But that was the reason that he introduced the gun, and he even called Joshua Camacho to the stand to talk about the gun, and he got him to admit that at one time he had a gun, but Joshua was not in the mood to cooperate anyway, and gave yes and no answers and said he didn't remember a lot and wasn't on the stand for very long at all.
What was Rachel Wade's demeanor? Like, had they done a pretty good job in that direct examination of sort of, like lots of times they'll change almost their appearance to look as wholesome and innocent as possible, and then her demeanor.
She was dressed in white and black, both innocent and in mourning. She was allowed to wear eye makeup the day that she testified, but she went without eye makeup otherwise. She seemed to be very well rehearsed, She gave answers by rote. She seemed very, very demure, very soft-spoken, tiny little voice. And it's amazing to watch it all crumble the second, Miss Hanowitz lights into her.
Yeah.
They start, they immediately start yelling at each other. And, poor Jay Aber, he's sitting there just going, oh, because the jury is hearing the voice they heard on the tape start to come out. Once Rachel gets agitated, you start to hear that manic sound, that there's something wrong with this girl's sound to her voice.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about...
One last question I want to ask.
Sure, sure.
Or one of the last ones. Who were the most compelling witnesses, and for who did they speak on behalf of, in your mind?
I was most impressed, I think, with Janet Camacho. Janet Camacho had a clear sense of who the good guys and the bad guys were, and came into that evening with that sense. Just the whole fact of, I didn't like Rachel because I thought she was bad for my brother. That's strong character assassination, right for the jury to hear. And right. the way she looked, she stared at the defendant while she testified. It's just very, 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 very strong. A strong woman who made it very clear that she attacked Rachel because Rachel had just stabbed her friend. And this whole notion of three girls jumping her was nonsense. They would have had a fist fight. It would have been broken up in 30 seconds. Maybe somebody had a bloody lip, and that would have been that. Except Rachel brought a knife. And that was what I found compelling. I talked to
Sarah had no
the lead detective. Go ahead. Hello?
No, go ahead, sorry.
Okay. I talked to the detective, the lead detective, Michael Lynch, and I asked him, why do the girls in this story have such low self-esteem? And he told me that he couldn't believe that there were so many fathers out there in Pinellas Park, and he presumed everywhere else as well, who allowed their daughters to have such dangerously low opinions of themselves. We're worthless without a boyfriend. Have to have a boyfriend all the time, or else there's something wrong with us. It reminded me when they asked Stephen King about the difference between Harry Potter books and the Twilight books. He says, the Harry Potter books are about stepping up, teamwork, facing your fears, and the Twilight books are about the importance of having a boyfriend.
Yeah.
And this is my book. A Knife in the Heart is the anti-Twilight books. This book, if there's a lesson to be learned here, it's that it's not that important to have a boyfriend. Grow up, be happy. And he says that he has daughters of his own, Detective Lynch, and that he is constantly just inflating their egos. And when his girls are older, he wants them to think that no one's good enough for them, and to demand the very best in how they're treated, no matter what.
Well, I think the thing is, I think we forget how it was when we were young. I mean, the thing is, I think kids have been forced to grow up much, much younger, and I think they look at everything much more seriously, and I don't think it's that much of a surprise. I have a 19-year-old daughter that is in a serious relationship with her boyfriend for the last 3 years. I mean, when I was that age, I couldn't even possibly grasp that, and I was not that kind of person, but I think kids have changed in that respect, and they take these things much more seriously. But you do add a mix of drugs and low self-esteem and maybe estrangement from their parents, or at least there's not as close as they could possibly be. And like you say, just this confluence of things, and you get this sad and tragic end result. But there is a fair amount of these people posing and making threats. That's what I find, too, that a lot of younger people make threats without understanding that somebody might take those threats that that they do daily and take them quite seriously. So,
right. Well, I spoke to a psychological counselor named Kathy Morelli, and she told me that there's a change in brain chemistry that happens to people when they have sex. A biological attachment forms, and the brain changes from shared experience produce potent emotions, causing normally mild people to resort to violence. Now, teenagers aren't adults, so it's a strong yet immature attachment. Passion stirs up primal possessiveness, and there's a strong chance that Rachel had problems at home, that she entered the world with a certain void, because most girls don't drop out of school and run away from home just because of an unwanted curfew. It's clear that she was a difficult child with whom to cope, and that there was maybe a mismatch in temperaments between the parents and the child. She, for whatever reason, didn't have any faith in herself as an individual. She combined that with poor decision-making, extreme anger management difficulties, and, there you go. And she's hooked on a boy who's narcissistic. He's got an inflated sense of self-importance, an exaggerated need for admiration. And as is true with many narcissists, he appeared arrogantly self-assured and confident, although that turned out not to be the actual case. We could see by observing his behavior that he reacted poorly when things weren't going his way. Long before the murder, he punched Sarah at one point. He pulled a gun on Rachel. His work history demonstrated a lack of ambition, perhaps because he feared competitive situations, and he lived his life avoiding the risk of failure. Narcissists, with their intrinsic lack of regard for others' feelings, they prey on people with dependent personalities. They feed off of others and enjoy being fought over, enjoy manipulating their sexual partners. Josh's girls were prey for the opportunist narcissist, and he was drawn to them like a shark to blood.
Do you also think it's somewhat interesting commentary, too, that it is quite rare for women to kill in comparison to the vast majority of being men? However, there seems to be a slight increase, especially in younger people, in terms of fighting in this kind of context, or parents killing their parents or killing siblings. And what I thought was interesting is that you talk about Rachel, but, Sarah did go there with a couple women, couple other women in a van. And, to you or I'm 53 years old, so I'm saying, man, that just sounds like a bunch of guys. And not all guys would have done that. So it seems oddly rare, or not rare, but odd that you do have this 19-year-olds in a van over a boyfriend, getting out of a van and somebody with a knife and somebody spotting someone else. It seems high drama and very, very serious. It almost seems like the kinds of things that boys would do, say, over a drug debt or something. But it seems out of place for young women to be acting like thugs.
It's almost unique. It's Detective Lynch says that 95% of all murders involve a male, and it's very uncommon for the remaining 5% woman on woman, girl on girl crime is very rare to begin with, and especially in a combative situation like this. He says there is an uptick in violence among teen girls, but it's the she looked at me wrong type of fight. There's hair pulling and scratching, and then it gets broken up, and there's a lot more cursing at each other. But nobody really gets hurt. He hopes this is a one-of-a-kind kind of incident.
I wanted to ask you, too, Michael, we've got just a few minutes left. We've got about 5 minutes left. But I wanted to ask you, how did you come to write? Because I know that you've handled all kinds of really heavy stories that other authors might back away from, very, very intense. Well, why? What about this story made you want to write about this case itself?
Well, I think it had to do with, in its own way, as I just said, it's pretty bizarre. I mean, it's not a serial killer, and it's not spooky, and it's not a horror story like the stories I usually tell. It's a psychological drama, And the question is, and I'm not even sure I answered it adequately, the question is, how did these girls get this way?
Yeah.
What is it about today's society, about maybe that region, maybe America, maybe the world? What is it about today that allows this to happen? As you said, they sound like they're guys.
Yeah.
They've been defeminized completely.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's the scrawny little male who wants to be kept, like a trophy.
Exactly. Yeah. And not like you say, just a little guy too. You know, just posing.
That's right.
Incredible. Yeah.
So anyway, my next book, we're going to get back to what's more in character, I think, for me. It's a true horror film of a book.
Really?
I believe it's going to be called Mutilator: The Art Gallery Butcher. It's the story of Elton Brutus Murphy, a former sailor who had once tried out to be a Navy SEAL, who claimed to hear voices in his head that ordered him to rape and kill women. For years, he says he battled the voices, which also told him that he was a special chosen one, perhaps a god himself, the Lord Brutus, he called himself. And the body of Joyce A. Wishart was found on Wednesday, January 21st, 2004, on the floor of her Palm Avenue Art Gallery in Sarasota, Florida. She was strangled and mutilated after death. Her crotch was surgically removed. And the thing that makes this book different for me was the killer's willingness to share with me his story. And he describes in great detail his slow descent into madness, and for the first time, details on how he killed and mutilated his victim.
Wow.
So that's...
I can relate. So that's, man, I'm looking forward to that.
Anyway,
that's
you once said
incredible.
my job is to keep ladies from going to sleep at night. So I think we'll return to form with that one.
I've heard that one before. I'm going to read the book, but not at night. I can't read it at night.
And, of course, I'm still conducting an investigation into a cold case double homicide, the hook being that the victims were classmates of mine. Two girls, 14 and 16, took place near my rural home. Gruesome sex murders changed, that neck of the woods forever. Certainly changed my world. And I'm working with a private detective named Don Tubman up in Scottsville, New York. And we're going to find out who did it. It's 45 years later, but we're going to give the mother, one of the victims, some closure.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Good work. Good luck to you with that. I'm sure you'll unearth something.
Thank you. Well, we already have. We're getting close.
Well, hey, I'd love to hear about that, and of course we'll have you back on the program talking about those two very, very interesting books that I'm sure you'll be pumping out of your incredible book factory that you have going on there and where you live. I want to thank you very much for coming on the program. Engaging. Another engaging interview and a great book. And for those listening, it's been A Knife in the Heart, Michael Benson's latest true crime, soon-to-be best-selling classic, no doubt. Thank you very much, Michael. Have yourself a good evening, and talk to you soon. Good night.
Bye.